Well, he just bought himself a pile of scrap. A few men laughed, and before the sound had even faded, another rancher shook his head and said the tractor hadn't run in 10 years. Someone farther back joked that the young man should have thrown his money in the river instead because at least the fish would have gotten some use out of it. Nobody tried to lower their voice, and nobody seemed to care whether he heard them or not. As far as they were concerned, they weren't being cruel. They were simply saying what everyone else at the auction yard was already thinking. Texas Hill Country, on a Tuesday morning in late May, was exactly where Ethan Walker hadn't planned to spend the last of his savings, but life had a way of changing plans. The county auction yard was already crowded before the morning haze had completely lifted, with pickup trucks lining the gravel entrance and ranchers standing in small groups over paper cups of coffee while auctioneers worked through rows of hay balers, cattle panels, worn-out implements, and tractors that had spent decades working the rocky hills of central Texas. Most buyers had come hoping to find dependable equipment they could haul home and put straight to work that same afternoon. Nobody had come looking for the old diesel tractor sitting alone near the back fence. It looked as though the land had already started taking it back. Rust had swallowed most of the faded red paint. Vines had climbed around one of the rear wheels. All four tires had collapsed into the dirt, and weeds were growing beneath the frame. Even the auctioneer barely gave it any attention, announcing that it had been sitting for nearly 10 years before asking for bids in the same tired voice he used whenever he expected no one to raise a hand. For a moment, the yard fell completely quiet. Buyers glanced at the tractor, then looked away just as quickly. A few smirked. Others simply folded their bidding cards and waited for the auctioneer to move on. Then, without saying a word, Ethan quietly lifted his card. The auctioneer pointed toward him, called the sale, and just like that, the forgotten tractor belonged to a 29-year-old farmer who could barely afford to buy it. The laughter started again almost immediately. One older rancher smiled as Ethan walked toward the paperwork and called out that he'd better own a good toolbox. Another answered that a toolbox wasn't going to help because what he'd really bought was 10 years of somebody else's problems. Ethan forced a polite smile, but inside he couldn't ignore the doubt creeping into his own mind. 3 weeks earlier, the transmission on his only working tractor had failed, and the repair bill had been far beyond what he had in the bank. Buying another machine wasn't something he dreamed about. It was simply the only choice left to keep his family's farm alive. As a loader eased the abandoned tractor onto Ethan's trailer, years of dried mud broke away from the underside, exposing a heavy steel attachment hidden beneath the rear axle. The loading crew never noticed it, and the farmers who had been laughing were already walking toward the next lot. But an elderly mechanic standing quietly near the fence suddenly stopped what he was doing. He stared at the tractor for several long seconds before slowly walking closer, his eyes fixed on that unusual piece of steel. Ethan noticed the expression on the old man's face and asked if something was wrong. The mechanic looked back at him, smiled faintly, and said, "Son, I don't think you bought what everybody else thinks you bought." At that moment, Ethan had no idea that the most valuable part of the tractor wasn't the engine, the transmission, or even the machine itself. It was the question that old mechanic had just placed in his mind, and that question would change everything. The old mechanic's words stayed with Ethan for the rest of the drive home. Although he tried convincing himself they didn't matter. The abandoned tractor rattled behind his pickup with every bump in the road, and there were far more practical problems demanding his attention. He had just spent nearly all the money he had left on a machine that didn't run, and before he could even think about repairing it, he still had to figure out how to unload several thousand pounds of dead weight onto a farm that was already struggling to stay afloat. Whatever the old man thought he'd seen beneath the rear axle could wait until another day. The following morning, Ethan parked the trailer beside the old equipment shed his father had built more than 30 years earlier. Very little had changed since the days when he was a boy handing wrenches across the workbench. The same battered toolbox still sat beneath the window. Coffee cans filled with old bolts lined the shelves, and faded grease stains covered the wooden floor where countless repairs had been made over the years. Standing there brought back memories he hadn't thought about in a long time, but there wasn't much time for nostalgia. If this tractor had any chance of running again, he needed to find out exactly what he had bought. He spent most of the morning clearing away years of dirt, mouse nests, and dried leaves that had collected beneath the hood. None of what he found surprised him. The wiring had been chewed in several places, the fuel system was filthy, and nearly every rubber hose had become brittle with age. It looked exactly like what anyone would expect from a tractor that had been sitting untouched for a decade. Yet every time he crawled beneath the machine, his attention drifted back to the heavy steel attachment mounted near the rear axle. It clearly hadn't been added by accident. Whoever installed it had done professional work, and the more Ethan studied it, the less sense it made. By early afternoon, curiosity had replaced repair as his biggest priority. Instead of ordering parts, he climbed back into his pickup and drove into town, hoping to find the elderly mechanic who had spoken to him at the auction. The small repair shop wasn't difficult to find. It had served local farmers for decades, and a handful of old tractors waiting outside suggested business had never been short. Walter Boone was exactly where Ethan expected him to be, sanding rust from an old cultivator while a portable radio quietly played country music somewhere inside the shop. Walter looked up as Ethan walked across the gravel and smiled before Ethan had even said a word. He admitted he'd been wondering how long it would take before the young farmer came looking for answers because he had seen the confusion on Ethan's face the moment that attachment became visible at the auction. After brushing the dust from his hands, Walter disappeared into the back room and returned carrying a thick binder filled with faded photographs, handwritten notes, and equipment records collected over more than 50 years of repairing farm machinery throughout Texas Hill Country. The old mechanic slowly turned the pages until he stopped at a photograph showing a tractor almost identical to Ethan's. It carried the same unusual attachment beneath the rear axle, and for the first time since buying the machine, Ethan realized it hadn't been someone's homemade modification after all. Walter explained that very few people alive still remembered what those attachments had originally been built for because the type of farming they supported had gradually disappeared from the region decades earlier. Most people assumed they had simply become outdated, but Walter had never believed that was the whole story. Ethan asked what kind of farming required equipment like that, but Walter didn't answer immediately. Instead, he closed the binder, looked through the open shop door toward the rolling hills beyond town, and asked where the tractor had come from. When Ethan mentioned the Harper auction, the old man's expression changed almost instantly. He nodded slowly and explained that the tractor had once belonged to Daniel Harper, a farmer who had earned a reputation for refusing to abandon land that everyone else considered worn out and unproductive. According to Walter, people had spent years saying Daniel was wasting his time trying to farm fields that nature had already given up on, but Daniel had always insisted the problem wasn't the land. The problem, he believed, was that people had forgotten how to understand it. Those words caught Ethan completely off guard because they sounded strangely familiar. His father had often said that good farmers spent more time listening to their land than arguing with it, although Ethan had never fully understood what he meant. Standing there inside Walter's repair shop, looking at an old photograph of a tractor almost nobody wanted, he couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't chasing the history of an abandoned machine anymore. Without realizing it, he had begun following the trail of a forgotten idea, and somewhere beyond that trail was a question that nobody else in the county seemed interested in asking anymore. Walter didn't offer Ethan any more answers that afternoon. Instead, he tore a sheet of paper from an old notepad, wrote down an address a few miles outside town, and slid it across the workbench. He explained that if anyone still knew why Daniel Harper had refused to abandon those fields, it would be Daniel's younger sister, Margaret. After Daniel passed away, she'd packed away nearly everything from the farmhouse instead of throwing it out, and Walter believed there were still records nobody had bothered to look through because nobody thought they were worth keeping. The Harper farmhouse sat at the end of a narrow caliche road surrounded by cedar trees and neglected pasture. Margaret welcomed Ethan inside after he explained why he had come, and although she seemed surprised that anyone still cared about her brother's old tractor, she admitted she had often wondered if someone would eventually ask the same questions Daniel had spent years trying to answer. She disappeared into a spare bedroom and returned carrying several weathered notebooks whose pages had yellowed with age. Every notebook was filled with handwritten observations rather than financial records or machinery repairs. Daniel had written down rainfall, soil conditions, planting dates, drainage patterns, and small details about each field that most people would have ignored. Ethan expected to find instructions explaining what made the unusual attachment so important, but instead he found page after page describing the land itself. Daniel had drawn rough maps of every pasture, marked places where water naturally collected after heavy rain, and made notes about how certain grasses appeared earlier on one hillside than another. Some entries were only a few lines long, while others filled entire pages with careful observations gathered over several growing seasons. The deeper Ethan read, the more one thing became impossible to ignore. Daniel wasn't obsessed with machinery. He was obsessed with understanding why every field behaved differently. One notebook stopped Ethan completely. Folded between its pages was an old aerial photograph of the Harper farm taken decades earlier. Daniel had marked several fields with circles and handwritten notes, comparing the way they were being farmed in the past with the way neighboring properties had gradually changed over the years. Across the bottom of the photograph, one sentence had been written in thick black pencil. The land didn't change. We did. Ethan stared at those words much longer than he expected. He had spent years believing successful farmers simply had better equipment, more money, or more experience than everyone else. Daniel's notebooks suggested something entirely different. They suggested that the best farmers weren't necessarily the ones who worked the hardest. They were the ones who noticed what everyone else walked past without seeing. Margaret quietly smiled as she watched Ethan turn another page and admitted that her brother had become increasingly frustrated during his final years because people kept asking him about tractors, fertilizers, and seed varieties while almost nobody asked about the land beneath them. She told Ethan that Daniel used to say a farmer could replace every machine in the shed and still fail if he stopped paying attention to the fields themselves. Most people dismissed those comments as the opinions of an old man unwilling to accept change, but Daniel never seemed interested in winning arguments. He only cared about proving his ideas in the field. Before Ethan left, Margaret handed him the notebooks and told him they had collected dust for long enough. She said Daniel would probably be happier knowing someone intended to use them instead of leaving them forgotten on a shelf, and as Ethan loaded the box into his pickup, he realized he had completely stopped thinking about fixing the tractor. For the first time since the auction, the machine itself no longer felt like the mystery. The real mystery was why one farmer had spent decades studying land that everyone else had already written off, and Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that the answer to that question might change far more than an old tractor ever could. For the next several days, Ethan barely touched the tractor. He ordered the parts it obviously needed, cleaned what he could between deliveries, and spent every free hour reading Daniel Harper's notebooks instead. The more he read, the more he realized the old farmer had almost never written about machinery. Nearly every page focused on rainfall, soil, shade, drainage, wind, and timing. Daniel seemed convinced that the land was constantly giving people information, but most farmers had become too busy looking at equipment to notice it anymore. One notebook kept pulling Ethan back. Daniel had filled almost 20 pages with observations about a small hillside field that hadn't produced a profitable crop in decades. County records described it as marginal ground. Neighboring farmers called it a waste of time, and even aerial photographs showed it slowly disappearing beneath cedar and brush. Yet Daniel had continued visiting that same field year after year, recording tiny changes that nobody else seemed interested in. He wasn't trying to prove the land was perfect. He was trying to understand why it behaved differently from every other field on the property. The following Saturday, Ethan carried one of those notebooks into the field for the first time. The grass reached almost to his knees. Young cedar trees had spread across one corner, and loose limestone covered much of the slope. Looking around, he understood why everyone had abandoned it. Nothing about the place suggested opportunity. Still, instead of judging it from the gate like everyone else had, he spent the next several hours walking slowly from one end to the other, comparing Daniel's notes with what he could actually see. Every few minutes he stopped to dig into the soil, check the depth of moisture, or study the way rainwater had carved shallow channels through the hillside. Late that afternoon, he noticed something Daniel had underlined years earlier. Water wasn't leaving the field where most people assumed it did. It was collecting in a completely different direction because of a series of natural limestone shelves hidden beneath the surface. Daniel had mapped those shelves by hand, and once Ethan saw them for himself, he couldn't believe he'd missed something so obvious. The problem had never been poor soil. The The problem was that generations of farmers had worked the field as though it were shaped differently than it actually was. Over the next 2 weeks, Ethan focused on that single piece of ground instead of trying to reclaim the entire farm. He cleared brush only where Daniel's notes suggested it had once been productive, repaired shallow drainage channels that had filled with years of erosion, and adjusted the old tractor's unusual attachment exactly as Daniel had described in one faded sketch. Even then, he wasn't certain any of it would make a difference. There were evenings when he drove back to the house convinced he was wasting precious time chasing the ideas of a man everyone else had already dismissed. Walter visited one afternoon while Ethan was finishing another section of the field. He climbed out of his pickup, looked across the hillside for several moments, and asked a simple question that caught Ethan by surprise. Instead of asking whether the tractor was finally running properly, Walter wanted to know what Ethan had learned about the land since the last time they spoke. Ethan smiled without realizing it because only then did he notice how much his own thinking had changed. A few weeks earlier, every conversation had been about machinery. Now he found himself talking about drainage, soil, sunlight, and patterns he had never paid attention to before. The first signs of change appeared quietly. After an early summer rain, parts of the field held moisture exactly where Daniel's notebooks said they would, while neighboring sections dried much faster than Ethan expected. Small differences most people would have ignored suddenly made perfect sense, and although nothing about the hillside looked remarkable yet, Ethan realized something far more important had already happened. He wasn't following Daniel Harper's instructions anymore. He was beginning to make his own observations, and for the first time since buying that abandoned tractor, he felt less interested in proving everyone at the auction wrong than in discovering whether the land still had more to teach him. The first person to notice wasn't an expert, a county official, or even Walter Boone. It was the same rancher who had laughed the loudest at the auction. Nearly 6 weeks had passed since Ethan hauled the abandoned tractor home, and one afternoon, while driving cattle along the neighboring fence line, he slowed his pickup, climbed out, and stood quietly watching Ethan work the hillside. He stayed there for almost 10 minutes before finally walking across the pasture, removing his gloves, and admitting he couldn't figure out why the ground looked healthier than it had in years. Ethan smiled politely and leaned against the old tractor, expecting another joke, but none came. Instead, the rancher pointed toward the hillside and asked what fertilizer he had started using. Ethan shook his head and explained that he hadn't changed fertilizer at all. The biggest changes had happened before anything was planted. He had spent weeks clearing blocked drainage paths, studying how rainwater crossed the property, and working with the land instead of against it. The older man listened carefully, glanced back across the field once more, and quietly admitted he had never thought about water moving through that hillside in the way Ethan described it. Before leaving, he asked if he could stop by again sometime and look at the notebooks Ethan had mentioned. That conversation spread through the community much faster than Ethan expected. Within days, another farmer arrived, then another, and before long, people who had barely spoken to him at the auction were finding excuses to drive past the property. Some came out of genuine curiosity. Others came hoping to prove he had simply gotten lucky. A few insisted there had to be some expensive product or government program behind what they were seeing because they couldn't accept that an abandoned field was improving through careful observation alone. Ethan never argued with them. He had already learned that people rarely abandoned old opinions because someone challenged them. They changed only after they saw enough evidence that their own explanations no longer made sense. Walter Boone visited one evening just as the sun began dropping behind the hills. The two men stood beside the fence looking across the recovering pasture without saying much for several minutes. Walter finally broke the silence by asking Ethan what he had learned since they first met at the auction. Ethan looked across the hillside before answering. A month earlier, he said, he believed good farming depended on finding better equipment. Now he wasn't even sure equipment belonged near the top of the list. Walter smiled, nodded once, and replied that most people spent their lives trying to buy better tools when they should have been learning to ask better questions. Ethan laughed quietly because the old man had somehow managed to summarize everything Daniel Harper had written across hundreds of notebook pages in a single sentence. The growing attention gave Ethan confidence, but it also tempted him into making the biggest mistake of the season. Convinced he finally understood what Daniel had discovered years earlier, he leased another neglected field a few miles away. On paper, It looked almost identical to the first one. The soil maps were similar, the slopes faced the same direction, and the previous owner had abandoned it for nearly the same reasons. Ethan believed he could repeat exactly what had worked before and achieve the same result in half the time. For several weeks, he followed almost the same process he had used on Daniel Harper's hillside. He repaired drainage, cleared brush, adjusted the old tractor, and planted with growing confidence. Then the first heavy rain arrived. When Ethan walked the property the following morning, his stomach sank. Water had pooled in places it never should have, sections of newly worked ground had washed away, and large areas already showed signs that the soil was behaving completely differently from the first field. Nothing made sense. He returned 2 days later hoping things looked better, but they didn't. For the first time since buying the abandoned tractor, he wondered if everyone at the auction had simply been right from the beginning. Maybe the first success had been luck after all. That night, he carried Daniel Harper's notebooks back to the kitchen table and began reading from the very beginning instead of searching for the pages that matched his current problem. Hours passed before one small detail finally caught his attention. Daniel had never repeated the same plan from one field to another. Every notebook described different observations, different adjustments, different planting dates, and different solutions. Ethan leaned back in his chair and closed the notebook slowly as the truth finally settled in. Daniel hadn't left behind a system for anyone to copy. He had left behind a way of thinking, and Ethan had spent weeks trying to imitate the answers instead of learning how Daniel found them. For the first time since the auction, Ethan realized the abandoned tractor had never been teaching him how to restore old machinery. It had been leading him towards something much more valuable, and until that moment, he had misunderstood the lesson completely. The next morning, Ethan returned to the second field before the first light had fully reached the valley. He parked beside the old wire gate, climbed out of his pickup, and stood quietly for several minutes without even looking toward the tractor. A month earlier, he would have walked straight to the equipment, convinced the next adjustment, the next repair, or the next pass across the field would solve the problem. This time was different. Daniel Harper's notebooks remained on the passenger seat, untouched, because Ethan had finally realized they were never meant to become instructions. They were meant to teach him how to observe. He stepped into the field carrying nothing more than a small notebook and a shovel. Instead of searching for answers, he began asking questions. Why did one patch of grass stay greener after the rain, while another dried almost overnight? Why did water disappear quickly along one edge of the property, but remain trapped near the center for days? Why had cedar trees slowly taken over one section, while native grasses continued growing only a few yards away? Every observation led to another question, and before long Ethan noticed something he had completely missed during his first attempt. The shallow limestone beneath the surface wasn't running in the same direction as the hillside itself. It angled slightly across the field, quietly redirecting water underground long before it ever reached the drainage channels he had spent weeks repairing. For the first time since leasing the property, the entire field suddenly made sense. It hadn't failed because Daniel Harper's ideas were wrong, and it hadn't failed because Ethan lacked experience. It had failed because he had assumed two pieces of land that looked similar would behave the same way. Standing there with muddy boots and a notebook full of fresh observations, he finally understood that the greatest mistake a farmer could make wasn't overlooking a problem. It was believing he already knew the answer before the land had finished asking the question. Over the next several days, Ethan changed almost everything about the way he approached the second field. Some drainage channels were filled back in because they had been solving problems that never actually existed. Others were redirected after he realized the natural flow of water had been working against every decision he had made during the previous month. He delayed planting in one section altogether after noticing the soil remained cooler beneath a thin layer of limestone, while another section received attention much earlier than planned because the ground warmed faster every morning. None of those decisions came from Daniel Harper's notebooks anymore. They came from hours spent walking slowly across the property, watching, listening, and allowing the field to reveal its own character instead of forcing it to imitate another piece of land. Walter Boone returned one evening, just as Ethan was loading tools back into the pickup. The old mechanic climbed out carrying 2 paper cups of coffee, handed one to Ethan, and together they walked toward the highest point on the property where both fields could be seen at once. Walter studied the recovering hillside for a long time before turning his attention toward the second field, which still looked rough in places, but no longer seemed lifeless. "I've been wondering when you'd stop reading Daniel's notebooks," Walter said with a quiet smile. Ethan laughed softly and admitted he hadn't stopped reading them at all. He had simply stopped looking through them for answers. Instead, he had started looking through them for better questions, and somehow that had changed everything. Walter nodded as though he had expected exactly that response. He explained that people often misunderstood Daniel Harper because they believed he possessed knowledge nobody else had. The truth, Walter said, was much simpler. Daniel noticed things other people considered too small to matter, and over enough years, those small observations became understanding. That was why he could stand in a field and predict where water would settle after a storm, or why one corner of a pasture struggled while another flourished. He wasn't guessing. He had simply spent enough time paying attention. Ethan looked across the property and smiled in a way Walter hadn't seen before. Months earlier, the young farmer had been desperate to prove everyone at the auction wrong. Every repair he made, every page he read, and every hour he spent in Daniel Harper's fields had been driven by the hope that one day the people who laughed would admit they had made a mistake. Somewhere along the way, though, that desire had quietly disappeared. He no longer cared about winning an argument that had ended weeks earlier because he had discovered something far more valuable than being right. He had learned how to look at the land with patience instead of assumptions, and that lesson had begun changing him long before it ever changed the fields. Walter finished his coffee, looked once more across the recovering property, and smiled before climbing back into his pickup. As he pulled through the gate, he rolled down the window and told Ethan that Daniel Harper would have been proud, not because the fields were improving, but because someone had finally understood what he had been trying to teach all along. Ethan watched the old truck disappear down the gravel road, then turned back toward the second field. For the first time since buying that abandoned tractor, he wasn't wondering whether the gamble had been worth it anymore. He already knew the answer. The machine had brought him there, but it was the journey that had changed his life. By the time autumn settled across the Texas hill country, Ethan no longer measured progress by how quickly a field changed. He measured it by how much better he understood it than he had the week before. Some mornings rewarded him with discoveries that made weeks of work worthwhile, while others reminded him how much there was still to learn. Oddly enough, he had stopped finding those difficult days discouraging because they no longer felt like failure. They felt like part of the conversation he was slowly learning to have with the land. The second field eventually began responding in ways even Ethan hadn't expected. Native grasses returned where bare patches had dominated for years. Runoff after heavy storms followed healthier paths through the property, and sections that neighboring farmers had considered beyond saving gradually became productive again. The transformation wasn't dramatic enough for someone driving past the fence to notice immediately, but the people who knew that land best couldn't ignore what was happening. They had spent years watching it decline, and now they were watching it recover without understanding why. One Saturday morning, while Ethan was servicing the old tractor outside the equipment shed, a familiar pickup rolled into the yard. The driver climbed out slowly, removed his hat, and stood looking toward the hillside before saying a word. Ethan recognized him immediately. He was one of the ranchers who had laughed at the auction and joked that the tractor wasn't worth hauling home. This time there was no laughter, no sarcasm, and no attempt to defend what he had said months earlier. Instead, he admitted that he had walked Ethan's fence line twice during the previous week because he couldn't understand why the recovering pasture looked healthier than neighboring fields that had received far more attention over the years. Ethan closed the toolbox, wiped the grease from his hands, and invited the rancher to walk the property with him. They spent nearly an hour crossing both fields while Ethan pointed out things he himself would never have noticed before buying Daniel Harper's tractor. He showed how water naturally slowed along one limestone shelf before soaking into the soil instead of running downhill, explained why one section needed less intervention than another, and described how every decision had started with observation rather than assumption. The older rancher listened carefully without interrupting, occasionally stopping to kneel beside the ground and study details he had walked past for decades. By the time they returned to the equipment shed, he admitted that he had spent most of his career trying to make every field behave the same way because it seemed more efficient. He had never considered that each piece of land might be asking something different from the farmer working it. That conversation marked a quiet turning point. Over the following weeks, more neighbors stopped by, not because they wanted to see the old tractor that had caused so much laughter at the auction, but because they wanted to understand the changes happening across Ethan's farm. Some brought old photographs of properties their families had worked years earlier. Others shared stories about grandparents who had farmed certain hillsides differently, without ever explaining why. Those conversations often lasted until sunset, and Ethan noticed something remarkable. The community wasn't simply becoming interested in one recovering farm. People were beginning to remember knowledge that had almost disappeared with the generation before them. Late that October, another county auction was held only a few miles from the one where Ethan had bought the abandoned tractor. The yard looked almost identical. Pickup trucks filled the gravel parking area, ranchers gathered around paper cups of coffee, and rows of weathered machinery waited for new owners. As Ethan walked through the equipment, he noticed a young farmer studying an old implement that everyone else had ignored. The young man looked uncertain, glanced at the crowd, and quietly admitted he couldn't decide whether it was worth taking a chance on. Ethan smiled because he recognized the uncertainty immediately. Just a few months earlier, he had been standing in almost exactly the same place, wondering whether he was making the biggest mistake of his life. Instead of telling the young farmer to buy the implement or leave it behind, Ethan asked where it had come from, who had owned it, and what kind of land it had been used on. The young man looked surprised by the questions because they had nothing to do with horsepower, repairs, or resale value. Ethan simply smiled and explained that machines usually told a story, but only if someone cared enough to ask the questions everyone else ignored. As he drove home that afternoon, the old tractor rattled gently behind his pickup just as it had the day he bought it. The machine still carried faded paint, worn tires, and the scars of decades spent working Texas soil, but Ethan no longer saw it as the best purchase he had ever made. The real value had never been sitting beneath the hood or hidden inside that unusual steel attachment. Its greatest gift had been leading him toward a forgotten way of seeing the land, and that lesson had changed far more than a single farm. It had changed the farmer. If you'd been standing in that auction yard on that Tuesday morning in late May, with everyone around you laughing at the young man raising his bidding card, would you have walked away with the crowd, or would you have stopped long enough to wonder what they might have been missing? Let me know in the comments below, and if stories about quiet perseverance, overlooked opportunities, and the wisdom hidden in rural America are your kind of stories, I'd love to have you join us for the next one.